He had a loyalty and a passion about this department and about doing good for students and pushing science forward. And if it meant that he had to roll up his sleeves and work late and do something in addition to what, the standard load was, he did it. He loved A&M and he loved this department.
He just is such a command of the kind of knowledge that makes every person better in their own individual way. It's just when you sort of meet those sort of polymath people that elevate everyone's knowledge about it. My interactions with Jim, of course, were his training of me as a scientist, and he's most responsible for turning me into the thinker that I became today.
Making food for people was one of the ways he took care of the people that he loved. And my mother lived with me at the end of her life. And Jim and Debbie came to stay at Jim's mother's home, and they came over every day and cooked dinner for all of us, just as a way of sharing their love for me and my family. And I'll never forget that.
But he was also extremely kind and considerate. So he was always arranging parties for people who were first arriving or leaving. It's just, it's social and human glue that the departments actually have to have. And he was, I'd have to think, I didn't compare with any particular vignette in mind, but it was just, he couldn't let somebody leave or arrive without celebrating it in some way and try to make them feel good about the experience. It was just, he and Debbie were incredibly hospitable in every sense of the word.
He was a really nice person, good-humored, pleasant, interactive, smiling. He was among my favorite people, in fact. I remember, and youthful and energetic, enthusiastic.
So he had this amazing ability to simplify complex problems, and he had the ability to explain complexity while he was able to retain simplicity. And so you were able to engage with Jim into a complex, extremely complex conversation. And his ability to master complex and abstract knowledge into simple components was absolutely amazing.
And he's also really well known for being an advocate for students and trainees. I definitely experienced that as a postdoc. He kind of took me under his wing, even though I wasn't in his lab, and took a lot of time to help me find experiences that would get me to the place that I wanted to be.
He was a famous procrastinator. If you knew Jim, you knew that he was the one burning the midnight oil. The deadline was the next morning, and he was up at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning preparing something.
I think he wrote all of the papers that he ultimately put into his tenure dossier, 48 hours before the request for letters went out. And that was just Jim. I mean, he was a total procrastinator.
He really liked experimenting with different things, different techniques. He loved entertaining. We would have a number of meetings and social events at his house with Debbie, and it was really probably one of the best times of my scientific career.
He, first of all, was very passionate about the department. He was very passionate about the graduate program. He was the head of the graduate program when I became department head, and I was very happy with him in that role. He was into computers, in particular Apple and Macintosh computers and hardware, and I was always interested in those things as well. So every time a new model came out, we usually compared notes pretty quickly and things like that. He ended up being far more proficient in the nuances of things and in programming things than I was. So I often went to him for advice when I was looking to get something new.
The biggest thing we probably ever had a big discussion over with is I was trying to make this vector, and I kept getting this really weird read, and it was 3 months of trying to make this thing. And so I thought it was me. And he finally sat down and like did some stuff in a different way and goes, that's right, I left that in there. And like he went and found his notebooks. He's like, oh yeah, it's there. And I was like, okay. and we figured it out. And then
many of us, including myself, were focused on one protein, one question, how do I understand some basic biological phenomenon in molecular and atomic and physical detail, right? Jim was not about that. He was thinking about things way more broadly, I think, perhaps before many others were. Now we're thinking like Jim was 30 years ago. I think the whole community is. So I think that's one of the things that comes to mind, I think, when I think of Jim's science.
He had neat names for his computers back in the early 2000s or so. Computers had names. Now people have laptops and cell phones and so on, and they don't have names. But Jim chose some creative names. His first computer, his first server was dimer, then trimer, tetramer, and then finally oligomers.
He was certainly somebody who wanted to be around all the time. For more than 20 years, I think essentially every day I either ended up in his office or he ended up in mine. The weird thing is, we almost never talked science, although we were both, primarily scientists. We talked about programmatic things, what the department should do, how things should be taught, so on, politics, sports, food, cooking, and I think we probably averaged an hour a day every day. So to the point where very often Daisy would be looking for me, she wouldn't even bother looking. There were 2 offices I might be in, and Jim was one of them.
So the two of us taught a graduate class together. And in that graduate class, we used to tease each other. We would say we were bad cop and bad cop because we both were pretty rigorous and we challenged the students. But what would happen is that they would go to see him in his office later and he would just cave and sort of be very nurturing and warm. And I ended up being, kind of the heavy. So one of Jim's favorite sayings was, sometimes to mold young minds, you have to crack a few skulls. And we used to laugh about that, but it wasn't, it was a funny thing that he said, but it was also just this sense that you have to shake some people up sometimes to shake them out of their complacency. But there really wasn't anybody who had a bigger heart and cared more about students than Jim.
He was also at the center of the intellectual life of my lab. He knew what everyone's project was, and he made amazing suggestions for how their projects could go better, how they could do things better. So it was really clear from the beginning that he was destined to be a professor.
He came armed with tremendous knowledge, this 360 information about everything from cooking to sports to science to politics, everything.
We had this fun group of faculty that hung out together, and one of the places that we liked to go eat together was called Thai Taste, and several of the people in our group were named Jim, including my husband, Jim Golden. And so we had been at dinner, we were walking out of the restaurant, and I turned around over my shoulder and said, Jim, and 3 Jims were standing directly behind me, all looking very alert for what I was going to say. So that certainly comes to mind.
Graduate students in general often come in with things they think are really big ideas. And they haven't done the due diligence to know that it's not right. And Jim would always entertain crazy ideas. And he would say the sentence, well, maybe you're right. It's always possible. But it does require that every single thing we know about this field up until today is wrong. So go for it and do that. And that was sort of the angle he used to get people to do a bit more research and think about the idea they had, was this error check against all of human knowledge.
Remember a special moment when we organized a trip to Colombia, to South America, to recruit students. And Colombia, unfortunately, has some bad reputation in terms of tourism. And I remember that some people in the department were probably scaring him a little bit about going to Columbia. So I remember a conversation that we had. This was, I think, a Friday afternoon, and we were supposed to fly on Sunday or something like that. And then he called me to his office and said, Leo, do you think it is necessary for me to go to Columbia? And then I said, absolutely, Jim, and you're gonna have a wonderful time. And so that was really funny. And after many years, he was able to recruit a number of students from different universities in Colombia. He even learned to cook a number of Colombian dishes. He just had a wonderful time.
He was big on talking about food and sports, and so we'd always talk about like new restaurants to go to and different like things he was cooking and techniques he was cooking.
We clicked together because we both like basketball, the women's basketball, and he always bought tickets to go to the women's basketball game. He always got up and just jumped up and cheered whenever some of the girls that I knew and he knew that I knew made points. And he would always just jump up and just cheer for him. And he was always smiling whenever he seen the girls there. And he just loved it. And especially when the national championship came in 2010, he was just very happy, cheerful, smiling for him. Him and his wife both was doing that.
From most of my interactions with him and talking to a lot of other people, he was always just very interested in hearing about people's research, and he always had his iPad with him. And so every seminar or every committee meeting he'd be in on, whether he knew your topic or not, he always was ready with a question, and it was always going to be one of the hardest questions you answered that day. And he just knew so much about so many different topics, and he was always there to give like great ideas for trying new things and problem solving. And he was constantly there to like push you and mentor you and just help you along. He was very encouraging.
There's lots of memories that I had with him. And I think one of the most interesting things that we used to have lab meetings, usually in Friday afternoons, so that, once we're done, we can just go home and relax. But he will always remember to bring, a box of donuts that had smiley faces in it. And it's just, every time he brings it, it kind of eases the tension of the lab meeting while we still have like very productive and enlightening, talks in terms of how to progress my research progress and to come up with many cool new ideas.
I knew he was very interested in UW sports, like women's basketball, especially, and stuff. We didn't really join him in those activities, but it was fun to listen to the post-game analysis the next day.
He was always encouraging me to explain things. In classes at A&M, I would have a little bit of trouble, and he'd make me come in and teach him what I learned in class that day. And so I think that is probably my biggest memory of him in terms of instilling in me how to teach and how to teach well.
One of my good friends is Mike Reddy, who's a program officer at the NIH. He's somebody who helps dispense grants. And when he heard that Jim was gone, he said, I don't know who to say this to, so I'm sending it to you. I remember the very first time I heard Jim give a talk at a much, much earlier iteration of the phage meeting. When I was a first-year postdoc in Piet van Hippel's lab, I was also a postdoc in Piet van Hippel's lab. I recall clearly Jim's constant smile that seemed to go ear to ear. He had this gentle way about him that was utterly foreign to me at the time because my PhD supervisor was the exact opposite. Years later, when I was on an NSF review panel with Jim, I came to realize what it was about Jim that set him apart. He was a genuinely kind human being and a totally giving scientist. He radiated empathy like a mini sun walking around the room. He made me want to be a better person.